Friends, a little note to indicate one of the effects of this program. It's a brief one. God love you. You are the only person who can keep my wife quiet for a full half hour. Since one good turn deserves another, I am enclosing $1 for the poor of the world for which you are caring. Any other men have wives that sleep? Reminds me of the man that I heard about. He hadn't spoken to his wife in 15 days. He didn't want to interrupt her. Would you like to hear something about psychiatry and psychology tonight? If so, let us start with first the normal. Briefly, the normal. Every human being has a vital principle inside of him which manifests itself in terms of urges, impulses, passions. Sometimes these have been called concupiscences. There are three of them, principally. One, there is self-perfection of the human mind. If we did not have that drive within us, we would never seek to perfect ourselves intellectually or socially. Now we have another drive, because man not only has a mind or a head, he's got a body. You see, in 5 years, 6 years, I haven't learned to draw any better. So there's another impulse which is directed to the body and its pleasures, and particularly this, just as this is self-perfection of the mind, so this is self-perpetuation of the human species. Now, in addition to these two urges that we have, one of mind and body, we also have an urge to that which is outside of us, namely the world. For example, well, the ownership of property. Have an urge to own things. For example, like an automobile. You know, listen. If there are any automobile designers working, I hope sometimes they give as much room in the future to people in the back seat as they do to a spare tire. Well, that's property. Now, these are very normal urges, and a person must not think, for example, that there's something wrong with him simply because he wants to perfect his mind, or because he wants to generate human species, or because he wants to own property. These things are normal. Now, it can happen, of course, that these will not always be controlled by reason or by the law of God. And when these impulses and passions and concupiscences and urges get the better of us, then this natural urge for self-perfection of the mind can become pride, egotism, selfishness. The urge of the body, self-perpetuation of the human species, when not subject to law and right reason, can become what used to be called lust and sometimes today is called sex, though not properly. And the third urge, if not controlled by reason, could become avarice, selfishness, or worldliness. Now, these, understand, are abnormal, not normal. Now we come to the science of psychiatry. In which is psychiatry interested? The normal or the abnormal? The abnormal. Now there are three psychiatrists who are most important in the science. In other words, they have given the major development to the science, and I am not mentioning them in the order of their importance. The one scientist, or psychiatrist rather, concentrated on only one of these urges, and that was Adler. The second psychiatrist concentrated on the flesh, carnality, sex. That was Freud. The third, on security, relationship to the objective world, and that was Jung. These are the pioneers in psychiatry. But before we explain their theories, we must make a distinction. The American minds do not like distinctions, but you cannot think properly without distinctions. Now, the distinction that we make is between a method and a theory. Suppose one were interested in the study of falling bodies, falling human bodies. Well, one way of investigating the study of fallen bodies would be through the camera. One might take pictures of human beings who fall. That would be a method of investigation. Now suppose you began explaining why the men fell. That's entirely different. Here you would be studying motives. Suppose one said, well, the reason this particular man jumped from the bridge was because someone called him a coward, and he wanted to affirm his superiority. That's Adler theory. Suppose another one said, well, no, he was sexually maladjusted. Freud. The other one said he just wanted to show off. He was an extrovert. Jung. These are theories. How do they agree and how do they differ? First of all, they all agree on the method, which is good. The method is psychoanalysis. The major credit for the development of the method of psychoanalysis must be given to Sigmund Freud. Adler and Jung, once associated with him, broke because he was emphasized sex too much. What is psychoanalysis? Psychoanalysis starts with the proposition that in addition to a conscious mind, we also have an unconscious mind. Now, need I tell you, I can't draw. I don't even practice my drawing, as I do not practice these telecasts. Oh, say, did you see? These are little octopuses that people sent me for the angel to erase the blackboard. This is a little boy octopus, and this is a little girl octopus. He's hanging out by his halo, see? Now, this is the first floor of a house. I've got to put the stairs going downstairs. I've got to put it on the outside of the house. But you understand what I mean. Now, this is the stairs that goes down, see? This is the cellar down here. So this is the unconscious mind, and this stands for the conscious mind, the first floor. And this is the cellar door. Now, just as many a housewife, for example, she has rags and bones and hanks of hair that she does not want on the first floor, she opens the cellar door and throws them down. Well, the mind does that too. The human mind often throws down in the unconsciousness many ideas which are unpleasant, which it seeks to repress, which are embarrassing. So they are thrown down into the unconsciousness. And it is rarely that they get upstairs. Why? Because there's a little man here that's called the censor. And whenever some little thought that's down here starts coming up the stairs, this little censor cracks him on the head. So he doesn't get up into consciousness. Well, does he ever get up? Oh, sometimes in dreams, say the psychoanalyst. But then the ideas are disguised. They do not come up as they really are. They come up in another form. You don't know what they mean, but the psychiatrist does. He knows. He'll tell you what they are, not for nothing, but he'll tell you. Now, on this, all of them practically agree. And this method of studying the unconscious mind is valid and right and good and necessary in many circumstances. Now comes the theory. How do you explain the unconscious mind, what is in it, and its relation to the conscious mind? Here you get no agreement. Three schools, Adler, Freud, Jung. Now let's take each of them one by one, although it was Freud who started. Adler. Adler says that there is in everyone a drive for superiority. This drive for superiority is thwarted, some reason or other. It's repressed, driven down into the unconsciousness. And it comes up in a disguised kind of way, what he calls an inferiority complex. So that the basic drive for superiority manifests itself by aggressiveness, by boasting, by loud-mouthedness, selfishness, and 1,000 other forms. In other words, it was Adler who gave us the words that are so often used, inferiority and superiority complex. That's one theory. Theory of Freud is this, that everyone is determined to be what he is, for the most part, during the first 6 years of his existence. During these first 6 years, a child senses a good many pleasures that are associated with certain organs of the body. In this unconsciousness, too, and here I quote Freud verbatim, there is the urge to cannibalism, incest, and murder. Every boy has within himself an urge to kill his own father in order to marry his own mother. That is what is known as an Oedipus complex. Every girl has an urge to kill her own mother and marry her own father. That is an Electra complex. Now, one would like to recover later on in life these pleasures of the first 6 years that are down here in what Freud calls id, id being a Latin word for that, just plain T-H-A-T. But up here in the consciousness, there is what he calls the ego and the superego. There's the taboos, there are the morals, there are conventions of society which repress these infantile urges, the id, which constitute human nature. Now, there are many Freudians who say, therefore, the way to release many of these complexes is to allow the id an uninhibited outlet. I say there are some Freudians who teach that. That's another theory. The theory of Jung is that in the unconsciousness is not only just this primary sex impulse of Freud. There is not only the personal, but there is also what he calls a kind of a racial unconsciousness. That is to say, the collective unconsciousness of the whole human race. There are myths, symbols, and so forth, by which man is in a kind of a symbolic relationship with his past. Man is constantly trying to get in contact with the world, if he can. And some manifest this contact with the world quite openly, and they become extroverts. And others find themselves at great pain in order to contact the world, and they remain inside of themselves. They are called the introverts. Now, those are the original theories of psychiatry, explained as simply as possible. Note that none of them have explained the whole man. Each has taken a third. Each is 1/3 right, incidentally. But they've not taken the whole man. Furthermore, they are only theories. The Rockefeller Foundation gave money enough to a professor of Harvard to analyze, for example, 116 articles and books, clinical studies, which were supposed to be explained on the Freudian theory alone, and the answer given after this long and expensive investigation was that these clinical cases could just as well be explained by any other theory. Now, it's important to remember that they are theories. The method is solid, the method endures. Now we come to a study, for that's what this is, a study of new developments in psychiatry. What is new? The first development is, and it breaks to some extent with the psychoanalytic approach, the recognition that man is a psychosomatic unit. Psycho, he has a mind. Somatic, he has a body. And the two are related one to the other. It has been proven by research, and I was recently talking to one of the doctors who is doing research along these particular lines. She is interested in the chemistry of the cell and metabolism. The scientist says that it is possible to notice the chemical changes in a cell where there is great fatigue. When the chemistry of the cell changes, it affects the glands, it affects the brain. Therefore, according to the newer developments, there is often, not always, there is often a physiological basis for psychoses and neuroses. In other words, the reaction now is against a kind of an angelism which regards the subconscious mind as something floating around in space. No, it's related to a body, it's related to an organism, and the body has effect on the mind, and the mind has an effect upon the body. Then to the new drugs, the Rowulfia drugs, the chlorpromazine drugs, all of these that were used first of all in treating heart trouble and also high blood pressure, now are found to have some effect not only in quieting, but in many instances of curing people who are suffering from mental diseases, with the result that thanks to these new drugs, There are 17,000 less patients in mental hospitals now than there were at this time last year. Mental patients are not staying as long as they did before. In other words, in many instances, there is a physiological, biological, metabolical foundation for mental diseases. And where the basis is chemical, psychoanalytic method will not do. That's one change. Another. And here, we're going to discuss principally those who still hold to the psychoanalytic method. There are a group of new psychiatrists which have left all of these passé. So when you go to a psychiatrist, be up to date. Get your money's worth. The newer development in psychiatry recognizes that man is not only a unit of body and soul, but he's also a unit. They're getting back again, you see, to the fact that there is not only an unconscious mind, but there is also a conscious mind. And psychotherapy must now begin to take account of the two. Some of these leading psychiatrists from all over the world, Bonaventura, who was killed in Jerusalem, great loss indeed for the field of psychiatry. Igor Caruso, Binswanger, Stalker, Carr, Holland, greatest of them all, Wilfred Dame, Rohrbacher, Lersch, and others. And what's the position of these psychiatrists? The position of these psychiatrists is, as one of them has put it, Bonaventura, there is something specifically human in man, namely his urge toward morality, that sometimes his unconscious mind can be controlled. Sometimes there may be a sense of guilt, and the psychiatrist must take account of it. But on the whole, all of these psychiatrists are now getting back to the fact that man, and this practically all of them agree, man has an intellect and a will. He has reason. He has the power of choice. In other words, he's a responsible being. And they're trying to give, as Carper said, some significance to life. And the meaning that they attach to existence and the problem of values has a tremendous effect upon them. And these psychiatrists are saying that it's not enough merely to analyze, for example, to find the dead acorn from which the oak came. You do not explain the oak by that rotted acorn. When a ship is sinking, it is not merely enough to analyze the waters that pour into the hold of the vessel. We cannot explain, for example, the statue of David by Michelangelo by saying that the marble was 6 million years in the bowels of the earth. You explain it also by something else. Namely, you explain it by the intellect, and the artistic skill, and the resolution of Michelangelo. So too psychiatrists now, even though they use the psychoanalytic method, as Dame does, they're now getting back to the fact that man is not an animal, that he's rational. In other words, there's now not just a psychoanalysis, but there's also a psychosynthesis. And psychiatry, therefore, is making great strides physically with these drugs that I mentioned. And now, we might almost say, in a true psychological sense, by recovering the true nature of man. And may I plead, particularly with college students, to insist that they be given, in addition to abnormal psychology in their classes, a little bit of normal psychology. Not everyone in this world is cracked. We're reasonable beings, and we ought to know, and our teachers should tell us, Namely, that we have not only a body, but we've got a soul, and we have reason, and we have the power of choice. We cannot be told that freedom of the world is in danger, and then be told the next moment by an antiquated school of psychoanalysts or psychiatrists that man has no freedom, that he's been determined completely by infantile urges. In other words, if we are to discover the full glory of this science, even with the psychoanalytic method, we will do it by recognizing the truth of what St. Augustine has said: our hearts were made for thee, O God, and they are restless until they rest in thee.
Friends, I was at a wedding this past week where I saw an exercise in public speaking. The groom was asked to give a speech. He protested. He said he had never given a speech before in his life. He would be very embarrassed, and he begged off, but everyone insisted. He stood up in order to cover his embarrassment and perhaps to get a little support. He leaned his hand on the shoulder of the bride. He began his talk saying, "This thing has been forced on me." I was giving a lecture not long ago in a hall, and I was heckled from the hall. Someone interrupted. It was not at all to the point of the lecture, and said, "How was Jonas in the belly of the whale for 3 days?" I said, "I really do not know. But I said, when I get to heaven, I will ask Jonas." He said, "Suppose Jonas isn't there." Well, I said, "Then you ask him." As you heard, this telecast is on the mentally sick, sympathy for them. Perhaps a good way to introduce it is to tell you a story of 2 dogs that were walking down Park Avenue the other day, and one of them said to the other, who was quite an aristocratic little French poodle whose name was Peluche, he said, "I understand you're having nervous trouble." "Yes," he said, "I think I'll have to go to a psychiatrist." The other dog said to Peluche, "Well, why don't you do it?" Peluche said, "I can't. Not allowed to get on a couch." Why is it that we have more mental disorders in the United States than there is in the Eastern world? 51% of the hospital beds of the United States are occupied by mental patients. A mental breakdown is almost peculiar to Western civilization. The reason is this: what keeps people normal is being under necessity. That is to say, having a destiny to work out, or the fulfillment of a quest of some kind. Now, the Eastern people are under a very elemental necessity. There are 2 kinds of necessities. One of them is physical. The Eastern people have to satisfy the elemental requirements of life, the 3 R's. In other words, they have to have a roof for their head, rags on their back, and rice for their stomachs. And as long as they are bound to strive to keep body and soul together, they keep normal. Our Western civilization is not under a physical necessity. There still is another necessity, which is moral. That moral necessity keeps people normal. It is the drive to be virtuous, to lead the good life, to eventually save one's soul. Now, if people do not have either a physical necessity or a moral necessity, they are apt to crack. That's one of the reasons why in our Western civilization we have not the problem of the 3 R's, we've got the ABCs: anxieties, boredom, and complexes. Now we might ask, what are, from a popular point of view, after all this is not a medical discourse, the principal kinds of mental disorders from which people can suffer? Well, they are 2 kinds, and we will describe them quickly and as briefly as possible. One of them is psychoses. The other, neuroses. One difference between the 2 is that this is organic. It is constitutional. It has something to do with blood and our whole physiological structure, though it could be induced also by some kind of shock. The other, the neuroses, is something that is acquired. It is not organic, it is a trait in personality. For example, someone who has a superiority complex, the desire to be above everyone else. We say this is organic. This is not to be helped so much by any kind of analysis. Some time ago, doctors made an experiment with rats who had been trained to go up certain strings and then to seek in apertures for food. The doctors took blood from a schizophrenic patient, a human being, and injected that blood into the rats. The rats, to a great extent, lost their training, which shows that the basis in some way is organic. That is one difference between the 2. Another difference between the 2 has to do with reality. The psychotic patient is to a great extent outside reality. That is to say, he lives in a world of fantasy. Suppose he's a paranoic and believes that he's being persecuted. That's not a real world. No one is actually following him, though he believes it. The neurotic patient, on the contrary, is in a much more real world, but he has disturbed relations about that world. To explain it much more simply, a psychotic patient believes that 2 and 2 equals 5. Therefore, he's wholly out of contact with the real world, has a logic all of his own. That's one of the reasons why it's rather difficult to use argumentation and reasoning with psychotic patients. The neurotic patient believes that 2 and 2 equals 4, but he's worried about it. Then another difference here, the psychotic has little responsibility, but has some responsibility. Here, there is great responsibility. The neurotic is in flight from responsibility, a flight to illness. For example, there was one man who had worked in an office for 20 years. He was sure that he would be named vice president. He felt that he should have been named one of the 76 vice presidents, but he was not. A younger man was named ahead of him. He developed headaches, sickness. He was not able to go to work. He was not really sick. He was in flight from responsibility because his pride was hurt. Now, those are some of the differences existing between the 2 kinds of mentally sick, which brings us to this other question. Why is it that so many people break? Now, here we're not so much concerned with the psychotic as with the neurotic, though the explanation will, to some extent, hold. The best explanation that there is that which is given by Dr. Viktor Frankl of Vienna. Now, he uses a very long term to describe it. Doctors must do that, you know. They're like philosophers and theologians. Sometimes big words carry the burden of those who are too lazy to think for themselves. And the test of understanding anything is always to be able to explain it. I can remember once when I was in class in philosophy, the teacher said to me, "Explain time. Give a definition of it." I said, "I know what it is, but I can't tell you." He said, "You do not know what it is. If you knew what it was, you could tell me." So now I wonder if I can explain Dr. Frankl's term for many, which he gives as the explanation of many neurotic cases. He calls it existential neurosis. In other words, it has to do with a meaning for life. He says that the drive is not a will to pleasure, not a will to security, not a will to superiority, but the essential drive of life is a will to meaning. For example, a person would not have a gadget in his house 10 minutes without knowing what it was for. But some people will live 10, 20, 30, 40 years without knowing why they're here or where they're going. After all, that's the first question that has to be answered. And until that question is answered, namely the meaning of existence, one is apt to develop a neurosis. After all, when you go to the dentist, sit down in his chair. Before the dentist applies the drill, he has a right to say to you, "What is your philosophy of life?" Because if your philosophy of life is wrong, he can't be sure you'll ever pay your bill. There must be some dentists in the audience. And to see that existential neurosis, how it works out in a small way on Sunday. Some people have Sunday neuroses. They do not know what to do with their time. Leisure is one of the big problems of Western civilization. We work only 38, 40 hours a week, and there are 168 hours in the week. What purpose is life the rest of the time? One of the reasons for juvenile delinquency, and we should call them not juvenile delinquents, but lawbreakers or hoodettes, little hoodlums. One of the reasons is these young people are in protest against their elders and their parents and their teachers, their educators, who are not giving to them a purpose of life. So they're out to destroy. They can see no goal or purpose in anything. Dr. Frankl, who passed through both the Nazi and the Soviet concentration camp, said that some men who completely lacked a goal or purpose in life thought of their prison existence as just to march to a grave. Then there were others, he said, as soon as a purpose came into the life, they got strength. He said, we were all starved in prison, and yet one day one of our starving men went into the Soviet pantry and stole 3 potatoes. The Soviet guard announced to us that we would be starved until the guilty person appeared with the 3 potatoes. There were 2,500 prisoners. Suddenly they had something to live for, to assert their superiority over the Soviet system. And for 48 hours, not one of them, even though they had nothing to eat, would give way to the one who stole the 3 potatoes. He said one other man who was suffering every form of torture in this concentration camp, and someone said to him, how do you bear it so well? He said, when I came in here, I made a pact with God. I promised him that I would endure every manner of suffering without any kind of protest, if only my wife would be spared from a Soviet prison camp. And that's what makes the difference. Example with our missionaries in China. As long as they can see beyond the suffering, it becomes bearable and endurable. One woman was telling me that every day when she was let out into the prison yard, the guard would open the prison just about that wide and take her 2 or 3 minutes to squeeze out, and all of that time he would keep spitting in her face. And she just smiled back at him. One day she said, thanks. And without cynicism. And when she came back, he said to her, why did you say thanks? He said, because you made it possible for me to understand how our Lord felt when he was spat upon. There was purpose. Nietzsche did not say many wise things, but one wise thing he said was, one can endure the how of anything if you only know the why. And Dostoevsky, who suffered so much in a Siberian prison at the close of the last century, said, I pray to God that I may be worthy of my sufferings. He was not suffering from a neurosis caused by the meaninglessness of life. Why is it that we have more sympathy for the physically sick than the mental? They get little sympathy.